Grant Holloway walked in expecting his best friend's sister. He found his billionaire boss, instead sitting alone waiting for him. Marlo Prescott never blinked in a negotiation, never let anyone close enough to use against her. Tonight she had broken every rule she had ever set. No assistance, no exit plan. Just 2 glasses of wine, and a secret she had been hiding for months. Grant barely had time to ask why before a camera flashed outside the window. Someone had followed them, and by morning that photograph would be worth exactly $1 billion and could end them both. Grant had arrived 5 minutes early, dressed, simply carrying none of the excitement a man was supposed to feel before meeting someone new. He had agreed to the blind date only because Dean Whitaker, his closest friend for over a decade, kept insisting that his sister was independent, grounded, and had no patience for games. Since his marriage had ended years earlier, Grant had barely dated at all, choosing instead to pour himself into work, into steadiness, into rebuilding a life that no longer wobbled beneath him. When the host led him toward a private table in the corner, he assumed the woman with her back turned was simply a stranger waiting for someone else, until she turned around and the air seemed to leave the room. Grant froze the moment he recognized her face, because sitting there in a plain black dress, stripped of the sharp tailored suits, and the practiced authority of the boardroom, was Marlo Prescott, the chief executive of Prescott Meridian Group, and the woman who signed off on his salary every quarter. His first instinct was professional, rather than romantic. He assumed Dean had sent him to the wrong address, or that something urgent at the company required her presence, and he addressed her by title, asking flatly if there was a problem at the office that needed his attention. Marlo told him to sit down, but Grant remained standing, reminding her that he was waiting for someone else entirely, a woman named Celeste, who was supposed to be Dean's sister. Marlo answered calmly that he was indeed waiting for Dean's sister, but that Dean had never actually promised that woman would show up tonight. Grant understood in an instant that his oldest friend had orchestrated an elaborate deception, and he felt something between betrayal and disbelief settle into his chest as the pieces fell into place. Marlo admitted without apology that she was the one who had asked Dean to arrange the meeting, because she knew that if she had invited Grant directly, he would have refused out of principle before she finished the sentence. Grant did not feel flattered by the admission. If anything, he felt like he had been placed into a situation with real professional danger attached to it. He asked her plainly why a woman who could have dinner with anyone in the city would choose a mid-level operations manager who reported 3 layers below her. She did not answer immediately, choosing instead to study the tablecloth for a long moment, before telling him that he was the only person at the company who had never once tried to impress her. It was in that silence that the light flashed outside the window, and Grant watched a shadow with a camera slip away from the curb and vanish down the block. He picked up his phone from the table, set it face up beside his water glass, and told her without raising his voice that if that photograph surfaced by morning, this would no longer be a dinner. It would be an attack, and they needed to decide right now how to survive it. Dean, for his part, had spent weeks preparing this moment with the kind of quiet persistence only a longtime friend could muster, convinced that Grant would never agree to any of it if he understood the truth from the beginning. He had watched Grant retreat further into work with each passing year, turning down invitations, avoiding parties, treating solitude like a discipline rather than a symptom of something unaddressed. Dean believed, perhaps naively, that if Grant could simply sit across from someone interesting for one evening, without the burden of expectation, some old buried part of him might wake back up. He never anticipated how complicated his small act of matchmaking would become, nor how close it would come to costing his best friend his career, his reputation, and very nearly his safety. Marlo admitted she had noticed him 6 months earlier during a shipping crisis that had thrown half the company into chaos and finger-pointing. While other managers scrambled to protect their own departments, Grant had been the only one who stood up in the emergency meeting and took responsibility for his team's failures, then quietly shielded the junior staff who had no power to defend themselves. She also remembered with unexpected clarity that he had turned down a bonus afterward, insisting that the people who had actually worked through the crisis deserved recognition before he did. Grant argued that those were simply the responsibilities of his job, not reasons for a chief executive to secretly arrange a date with an employee she barely knew outside of quarterly reports. Marlo conceded the point honestly, admitting she genuinely did not know how to ask someone to dinner without the invitation being colored by her title, her money, or the fear that always followed both. Grant told her that having his best friend lie to him was not exactly the ideal way to begin building trust, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He began to rise from the table, prepared to walk out the way he had come in, until something in the stillness behind her composed expression stopped him. There was no security detail lingering by the door, no assistant checking a phone in the corner, no driver idling outside. For the first time since he had known her, she looked like an ordinary woman sitting alone, stripped of every symbol of power that usually surrounded her. Grant sat back down, but only after laying out one condition: that they would treat this as two adults, sharing a meal, nothing more, no promises made, and no favors owed. And if the situation ever threatened the company, there would be no secrets kept from either side. Marlowe agreed without hesitation, and the conversation that followed started stiffly, since she was accustomed to asking questions the way an interviewer would, testing rather than listening. Grant gently pointed this out, and for the first time that evening she laughed a real laugh, unguarded and slightly startled by itself. He revealed little about his personal life, beyond the fact that he had spent years placing duty above every desire of his own, mentioning only briefly that he had once raised a daughter alone, who was now grown and living her own life far from these conversations. Marlowe told him she had inherited the company after her father's sudden death, and had survived a string of relationships built entirely on ambition rather than affection, including one man who sold private details of her life to a tabloid, and another who used her name to court investors behind her back. Grant understood, without needing further explanation, exactly why trust did not come easily to her. As the dinner wound down, Marlowe asked quietly whether they might see each other again in a setting that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or boardroom politics. Before Grant could answer, his phone buzzed violently against the table, and Dean's voice came through tense and urgent, warning them to leave the restaurant immediately because someone had already sent the photograph to a member of the board of directors. Marlowe's phone lit up seconds later with a message from an unknown number, cold and precise in its threat, demanding that she abandon the merger vote before 9 o'clock the next morning, or the entire company would learn exactly how her new companion had earned his recent promotion. Grant read the message over her shoulder and felt the night shift from unexpected romance into something far more dangerous. A game where the stakes were no longer just gossip, but the survival of a company employing thousands of people. Marlowe wanted to call her security team and the communications department immediately, but Grant urged her to wait, arguing that whoever sent that message wanted her to panic and make mistakes that would leave fingerprints of their own. He asked her to think instead about the camera angle, the exact timing, and the escape route the photographer had used, pointing out that whoever took that photo had known precisely which table they would be sitting at before either of them arrived. That single detail proved the leak had come from someone who knew the plan in advance, someone close enough to have access to details that should have stayed private between only a handful of people. Only 3 people had known the details of the evening: Marlowe herself, Dean, and Marlowe's executive assistant, though Grant refused to leap to conclusions without evidence. They left through the kitchen exit, and Marlowe was visibly surprised by how calmly Grant coordinated with the restaurant staff, guiding them around the cameras already gathering at the front entrance, like vultures sensing a story. In the car, she offered to have her driver take him straight home, but Grant refused, insisting they go to company headquarters instead, even though appearing there together at midnight would only fuel the rumors already spreading. He told her that if they separated now out of fear, whoever had sent that threat would know it had already worked, and that kind of surrender only invited more pressure. At the office, they pulled up the access logs for the executive floor and discovered that someone had opened Marlowe's private planning files using elevated administrative credentials earlier that same evening. Grant noticed that the restaurant reservation itself had never appeared anywhere in the company calendar system, existing only on a handwritten note Marlowe had scribbled and later torn up, which meant whoever leaked it had physically been inside her private office. Blythe Carrington appeared unexpectedly, claiming she had returned for a forgotten file. And though she feigned surprise at finding the two of them together, she immediately began referencing internal relationship policy in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Grant caught the detail that Blythe seemed to already know about the dinner, despite neither of them having mentioned it to anyone. When Marlowe asked directly how she had heard, Blythe simply said word travels fast in media circles, before excusing herself and disappearing down the hallway. Grant's suspicion deepened immediately, though Marlowe cautioned against jumping to conclusions about a woman who had worked alongside the Prescott family for over a decade and had helped steady the company through an earlier crisis. While reviewing the operational data late into the night, Grant discovered a chain of transactions tied to the pending merger that had been deliberately split into smaller pieces, each one falling just under the threshold that would have required the chief executive's direct approval. Added together, the fragmented transfers totaled more than $18 million, quietly siphoned through a maze of shell accounts designed to avoid detection during a routine audit. Each transaction had been dressed up with a plausible internal justification. A vendor payment here, a consulting retainer there, small enough on its own to escape scrutiny, but devastating once assembled into a single undeniable pattern. Grant recognized the discipline behind the scheme immediately. Whoever built it understood the company's approval thresholds intimately, which meant the person responsible had either worked in finance for years or had studied the internal controls with unusual patience. That kind of precision unsettled him more than any single stolen dollar amount ever could, because it meant the threat sitting across the table from Marlowe wasn't impulsive or desperate. It was methodical, patient, and already several steps ahead of them. Marlowe watched Grant's expression change as understanding settled in, and she realized this was no longer about a leaked photograph or wounded pride, but something far more calculated, something built over months rather than hours. Grant felt a flicker of respect grow between them, as she resisted the urge to panic, choosing instead to sit beside him and trace the numbers line by line, without flinching from what they revealed. As he opened the final payment record on the screen, Grant went suddenly still, staring at an electronic signature attached to the largest transfer, a signature that was unmistakably his own on a document he had never once seen or signed. The forged signature turned Grant overnight from a trusted operations manager into the presumed architect of a financial scheme that could be framed as an affair used to cover embezzlement. He understood instantly that the photograph from the restaurant was never a standalone attack, but the second half of a much larger trap designed to destroy both his career and Marlowe's authority in a single stroke. Whoever orchestrated this did not simply want the merger stopped. They wanted the public to believe that the chief executive and her secret companion had conspired together to steal from the very company that employed thousands of people. Marlowe suggested suspending Grant temporarily to protect him during the investigation, a gesture born from genuine concern, but Grant pushed back hard, arguing that a sudden suspension right after a leaked photograph would look exactly like a confession of guilt. For the first time since the dinner began, the two of them argued openly, their voices sharp with the tension of two people used to controlling every outcome around them. Marlowe was accustomed to protecting people through the sheer force of her authority, while Grant refused to be shielded by decisions made on his behalf without his consent. He reminded her firmly that he was not some fragile subordinate who needed rescuing, and that treating him that way echoed the very dynamic the board had always used against her, deciding what was best for someone without ever asking what they actually wanted. Marlowe recognized the pattern in herself immediately, and apologized, something Grant sensed did not come easily to a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told that apologies were signs of weakness. Together, they built a plan they would not deny. The photograph outright would not announce any suspension, and would allow whoever orchestrated the scheme to believe their trap was working exactly as intended, while quietly tracing the digital fingerprints left behind by the forged signature and the administrative account used to alter the records. By the next morning, a business news outlet had already published the photograph beneath a headline suggesting the chief executive was showing favoritism to a secret lover inside her own company. Executives who passed Grant in the hallway offered careful, suspicious glances, and rumors spread quickly among colleagues who had long envied his quiet efficiency, some of them already whispering about an imminent unearned promotion. Blythe urged Marlowe to issue a public denial and terminate Grant immediately to protect the falling stock price, framing it as the only responsible move a serious leader could make. Marlowe refused to fire him without a completed investigation, and Russell Maddox warned during a tense hallway exchange that the board might vote to suspend her own authority if she allowed personal feelings to compromise the company's stability. Rather than wait to be summoned, Grant walked into the boardroom himself, offering to surrender every device he owned and submit to a full audit of his access credentials, refusing to let anyone else fight this battle on his behalf. His composure unsettled, several board members who had expected either panic or denial, and a few began quietly questioning whether the entire scandal had been staged for reasons that had nothing to do with an inappropriate relationship. The audit team soon confirmed that the forged signature had originated from a computer inside the chief executive's own private office, and every eye in the room turned slowly toward Marlowe as the weight of that detail settled over the table. Russell rose from his chair and declared in a voice pitched for maximum effect that either Grant Holloway had forged the signature using her computer or she herself had helped him steal $18 million, and the board deserved to know which version of the truth they were living in. The room erupted into a low murmur of shocked whispers, board members leaning toward one another as if proximity might help them decide which story to believe. Marlowe sat perfectly still, refusing to give Russell the reaction he was clearly hoping to provoke, though Grant could see the tension gathered along her jaw, the effort it took to keep her voice level when she finally spoke. She reminded the room that accusations were not evidence, and that a forged signature discovered on her own computer was, if anything, proof that someone had deliberately targeted her office, rather than proof of her guilt. Still, she knew as well as anyone in that room that perception moved faster than fact, and that by the time the truth caught up, the damage to both her reputation and Grant's might already be irreversible. The board convened an emergency session where Russell proposed suspending Marlowe's authority until the investigation concluded, while Blythe feigned reluctance even as she quietly worked the room, urging members toward a vote against her. Someone suggested privately that Marlowe could save her position simply by claiming Grant had manipulated her using intimacy to gain access and influence he never actually deserved. When Grant overheard the suggestion, he approached Marlowe directly and told her without bitterness that she should do whatever was necessary to protect the company, even if that meant sacrificing his reputation entirely. Marlowe asked with real anger beneath the calm whether he actually expected her to publicly brand him a manipulator, just so she could preserve her own image as a competent leader. Grant answered that a personal reputation could always be rebuilt, but thousands of employees would suffer real consequences if the company fell into the hands of people actively working to dismantle it from within. Marlowe was moved by his willingness to sacrifice himself, yet furious that he assumed he had the right to make that choice for her without being asked. Grant clarified quietly that his offer had nothing to do with her title, and in that single sentence, the unspoken feelings between them were acknowledged for the first time, without either of them needing to say the word out loud. Dean arrived with new information, revealing that the restaurant photograph had been sold to the press through a shell media company secretly financed by an investment fund, attempting to acquire Prescott Meridian shares at a steeply discounted price. Grant laid out the full scheme for Marlowe: drive down the stock price, force her out of power, sabotage the merger, and then buy the company for a fraction of its true worth once the chaos had run its course. They still lacked direct evidence tying either Russell or Blythe to the fund itself, though Grant noticed that every suspicious transaction had occurred on days when the security systems were serviced by the same outside contractor originally recommended by Russell himself. During the board meeting, Marlowe refused to place the blame on Grant, telling the room plainly that whatever personal connection existed between them amounted to a single dinner and had never influenced a single business decision. When Russell pressed her to explain why she had secretly arranged to meet a subordinate at all, Marlowe answered without flinching that she had trusted him before she ever realized she had feelings for him, and the room fell into an uneasy silence that no one seemed willing to break. She agreed to temporarily step back from approval authority over the merger, but refused outright to resign her position. Afterward, Grant asked why she hadn't simply denied any emotional connection to protect herself, and Marlowe told him she had spent her entire life defending that chair with coldness, and she would not start defending it now with a lie about him. Moments later, as they prepared to leave the building, Grant received an internal email containing evidence claiming he had accessed company accounts from home at 2 a.m, even though at that exact hour he had been sitting across a candlelit table from Marlowe herself. The fabricated access record was designed to prove Grant had authorized illegal transfers remotely, but he noticed something: the forger had overlooked a discrepancy of exactly 1 hour caused by mismatched time zones between the report's formatting and the company's true server logs. Grant had been part of the server migration project 2 years earlier and understood the system architecture intimately, a detail the person who fabricated the evidence clearly hadn't accounted for. Marlowe wanted to bring the discovery straight to the board, but Grant urged patience, warning that revealing the flaw too early would only give the forger time to erase whatever traces remained. Dean arranged for a data preservation order through their outside security contractor, and together Grant and Marlowe traveled to the off-site storage facility. Under the pretense of an urgent routine inspection, during the drive, in a rare stretch of quiet honesty, Marlowe asked whether Grant regretted ever sitting down at that table, and he admitted his only regret was not recognizing how frightened she truly was until it was almost too late. He told her that power made people assume she needed no one standing beside her, and Marlowe asked directly whether he was standing beside her now out of genuine feeling or simple obligation. Grant didn't answer the question head-on, saying only that they needed to survive the crisis together before either of them made decisions capable of affecting thousands of lives beyond their own. Marlowe accepted the deflection without pressing further, though something in her expression told him she had heard the answer underneath the answer and had chosen for now to let it rest quietly between them rather than force it into the open. The countryside blurred past the car windows, dark fields and distant lights, and for a few miles neither of them spoke at all, content simply to exist in the same space without needing to solve anything further. It was a small mercy that silence, the first unhurried moment either of them had been given since the night at the restaurant, had shattered into chaos. At the storage facility, Grant found a fragment of the original access log that hadn't been fully erased, revealing that someone had copied his authentication credentials directly from the chief executive's own computer. The account responsible for the theft belonged to the strategy division under Blythe's direct control, yet the authorization granting that account elevated privileges bore Russell's digital signature. Marlowe was devastated to realize that two people she had trusted for years inside her own boardroom had likely conspired together against her, and for a moment her composure cracked in a way Grant had never seen before. They needed proof no one could argue away, so Grant proposed planting a single false document, visible only on Marlowe's private computer, describing a fabricated decision to sell company shares to the investment fund at a specific price. Each copy of the bait document carried a unique hidden marker, meaning that if the information leaked, they would know exactly which account had stolen it. Marlowe agreed, though she warned that if the plan failed, she would lose the company outright, with no second chances left to fall back on. Grant told her plainly that she had already lost control the moment she trusted the wrong people, and that all they were doing now was taking that control back piece by piece. In a brief, unguarded moment, Marlowe reached for his hand, not out of weakness, but because for the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to lean on someone else without calculating the cost. Less than 20 minutes after the bait document was saved, the investment fund sent an acquisition offer matching the exact figure buried inside it, and the hidden digital marker traced the leak directly back to an account controlled by Blythe. Marlowe called one final board meeting, announcing publicly that she would seriously consider the fund's acquisition offer. And Blythe, believing her scheme had finally succeeded, began pressuring Marlowe to sign before the audit results could be released. Grant was barred from attending officially, still under investigation, though he agreed to remain outside while quietly coordinating with Dean and the legal team behind the scenes. Before the meeting began, Blythe met privately with Grant, offering to erase every piece of evidence against him if he publicly claimed that Marlowe herself had orchestrated the forged signature. She told him that Marlowe was about to lose her position anyway, and insisted he shouldn't sacrifice his career for a woman who was only using him as an emotional shield during a moment of weakness. Grant pretended to waver just enough to draw more information out of her, and Blythe revealed that once Marlowe was removed, Russell would become interim chief executive while she personally oversaw the sale of the entire company. Grant secretly recorded the conversation, though Blythe was careful never to explicitly admit to the embezzlement itself. Shortly afterward, Blythe sent Marlowe a heavily edited video clip designed to make it appear that Grant was negotiating to betray her, and Marlowe watched it just moments before the vote was set to begin. The footage struck a deep old wound, reviving her greatest fear that anyone who earned her trust might eventually approach her only for personal gain. When Grant tried to explain what had actually happened, Marlowe coldly ordered him off the executive floor, refusing to hear another word. Grant didn't beg or argue. He simply placed the small recording device on her desk and told her that even if she could no longer trust him as a man, she owed it to herself as a chief executive to listen to what was on it before making her final decision. He walked out without looking back, leaving Marlo alone with the recording, and the growing suspicion that the video she'd been shown was never what it appeared to be. As she listened to the full unedited conversation, Marlo realized Blythe had manipulated the footage to fabricate an entirely false betrayal. Meanwhile, Russell demanded an immediate vote to accept the fund's acquisition offer before anyone had time to second-guess the decision. Marlo walked into the boardroom and, feigning total loss of faith in Grant, announced that he had betrayed her and ordered security to bring him in for questioning in front of the entire board. Blythe, convinced her plan had worked flawlessly, watched with quiet satisfaction as Grant was escorted inside, still uncertain himself whether Marlo was performing a role or truly believed the worst of him. Marlo looked directly at Grant and instructed him to show the board the evidence he had supposedly used to betray her, and in that instant, Grant understood the plan they had built together was still very much alive. Grant connected his laptop to the boardroom display, but instead of presenting evidence against Marlo, he projected 3 separate timelines onto the screen: the moment their dinner plans had first leaked, the moment his signature had been digitally copied, and the moment the investment fund had received the confidential merger data. He walked the board carefully through the time zone discrepancy that had exposed the falsified access record as an amateur forgery rather than an authentic system log. Dean entered the room as independent legal counsel, presenting the data preservation order and confirming through the untouched original server records that Grant had never logged in at the time he was accused of doing so. Marlo revealed the bait document and its hidden digital marker, tracing the leak directly to an account under Blythe's control. Blythe insisted the account might simply have been stolen or compromised by someone else entirely, but Grant calmly countered by playing security footage from the storage facility, showing Blythe's own assistant using an access card that had been personally issued by Russell. Russell attempted to leave the room, but Marlo had already instructed security to lock down every exit before the confrontation began. Grant played the recorded conversation with Blythe, and although she never explicitly confessed to embezzlement, her own words revealed foreknowledge that Russell would become interim chief executive and that the company was already slated for sale. Dean produced ownership records tracing the shell media company that had sold the original photograph, revealing its ultimate beneficiary as a trust closely tied to Russell's family holdings. Marlo then presented the preliminary audit findings. The missing $18 million had not vanished, but had been funneled into fabricated consulting firms later used to purchase stock options designed to profit enormously if Prescott Meridian's share price collapsed. Both Russell and Blythe stood to gain financially from the very crisis they had engineered from the shadows. Marlo walked the board through the mechanics of it, slowly making sure even the least financially literate members understood exactly how their trust had been weaponized against them. She explained how the shell consulting firms had been registered months in advance, how the option contracts had been timed to mature right around the projected collapse of the stock price, and how every piece of the scheme depended entirely on nobody looking closely enough, soon enough to notice the Brassapresset pattern. It was, she admitted quietly, a plan built by people who understood the company better than most, which was precisely what made it so dangerous, and precisely why it had so nearly succeeded. Blythe turned on Marlo, accusing her emotional weakness of creating the opening for the entire scandal to unfold in the first place. Marlo admitted without deflecting that secretly inviting a subordinate to dinner had been a genuine lapse in judgment, but she made clear that a personal mistake could never excuse fraud, extortion, and the deliberate sabotage of a company that thousands of families depended on. Grant also acknowledged publicly that he had joined the dinner willingly, but insisted he had never received a single favor, promotion, or expanded access beyond what his actual job required. The independent members of the board voted unanimously to suspend both Russell and Blythe, forwarding every piece of evidence directly to financial investigators for formal prosecution. As security led Blythe from the room, she turned back and asked Grant coldly whether he truly believed Marlo would choose him over her own company. Grant said nothing, and Marlo answered instead, telling the room plainly that he had never once asked her to choose between the two. Once the boardroom finally emptied, Marlo told Grant that although he had been fully cleared, they still could not simply return to how things were before any of this began. Grant understood exactly what she meant. Even though neither of them had committed a genuine financial crime, The underlying imbalance between a chief executive and her subordinate remained an unresolved conflict of power that couldn't simply be forgiven away by a successful outcome. Marlowe refused to let their victory over the board serve as an excuse to justify a relationship that still lacked clear, honest boundaries, and Grant found himself agreeing with her completely, however painful the agreement felt. He made the decision on his own to resign from Prescott Meridian Group once the investigation was formally closed, refusing to let anyone believe he had been promoted or protected purely because of his connection to her. Marlowe pushed back, arguing that Grant was one of the most capable operators the company had, someone who had proven his integrity under the most brutal possible circumstances imaginable. Grant told her that if she genuinely respected him, she needed to let him choose his own future without her influence, shaping the outcome in either direction. They agreed to avoid seeing each other outside of strictly professional matters until the transition period was fully complete, a decision that cost them both more than either wanted to admit aloud. Over the following weeks, Grant helped stabilize daily operations as the company slowly recovered from the scandal, declining every request from reporters to discuss his personal life and instead redirecting every conversation toward ongoing investigation and the well-being of the employees caught in the middle of it. Marlowe, meanwhile, launched a sweeping overhaul of corporate governance, introducing independent oversight committees, banning the practice of splitting transactions to dodge required approvals, establishing clear policy around internal relationships, separating executive authority from audit control, and creating formal protections for employees who came forward with concerns in the future. The company's stock price began a slow, steady recovery, and the stalled merger was reopened for review under a newly independent committee designed to prevent any single executive from wielding unchecked control again. Employees who had spent weeks whispering in hallways and second-guessing every decision from the executive floor slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. Though the scandal left a lasting mark on how the company understood fragility of its own systems, analysts who had once questioned whether Marlowe was fit to continue leading the company began instead praising the speed and transparency with which she had handled the fallout, noting that few executives would have willingly exposed their own boardroom to that level of scrutiny. Marlowe found little comfort in the praise, aware that rebuilding trust inside the company would take far longer than repairing its balance sheet. Grant was soon offered his first true leadership role, an invitation to run a struggling logistics company as its chief executive, a position entirely separate from anything connected to Marlowe or her empire. Marlowe understood immediately that accepting the offer would mean Grant was no longer her subordinate in any sense. Yet she made no attempt to influence his decision one way or another, determined to prove she had truly changed. On Grant's final day at Prescott Meridian, the entire operations team rose from their desks in quiet applause, and Grant offered no grand farewell speech thanking them simply for trusting facts and evidence over rumor when it would have been far easier to believe the worst. Marlowe was noticeably absent from the small gathering, and Grant assumed with a quiet ache he didn't examine too closely that she had decided to let things end there for good. That evening, Dean called and asked Grant to come back to Bellwether House, claiming his sister finally wanted the chance to apologize in person for never showing up to their original blind date. Grant knew immediately that Dean was orchestrating something again, yet he went anyway, unable to fully resist the pull of curiosity mixed with something warmer underneath it. At the same familiar table, sitting completely alone, was Marlowe, and this time there were no hidden cameras waiting outside. No board members lurking in judgment, and no professional hierarchy standing silently between them. Grant approached the table but didn't sit down right away, asking first whether Dean was still running some elaborate scheme behind the scenes. Marlowe smiled and slid a small folded card across the table toward him, and written inside in Dean's familiar handwriting were the words explaining that the first meeting had been entirely her plan. But this one belonged to both of them equally. She told Grant she had waited deliberately until he had officially left the company, unwilling to invite him sooner out of fear he might mistake the gesture for gratitude or some lingering sense of obligation. Grant asked plainly whether she had come tonight as a chief executive or simply as a woman who wanted to share a dinner with him. Marlowe answered that she could never fully stop being a chief executive, but tonight at least she didn't need him to be her employee. Grant finally sat down across from her. Marlowe apologized again for building their very first encounter on a foundation of deception, admitting she had been so afraid of rejection that she tried to engineer every detail of the outcome in advance. Grant admitted in turn that he had used professional principle as a wall for years to avoid the risk that came with wanting something purely for himself, convincing himself that responsibility and personal happiness could never coexist. Marlowe asked whether he had truly accepted the position leading the logistics company, and Grant confirmed that he had, explaining he wanted to build an organization where employees never needed power or status, just to be heard, respected. Rather than fearing the distance this new role might create between them, Marlowe seemed genuinely pleased, and Grant understood that her reaction proved she no longer needed to control the direction of his life to feel secure in her own. They agreed to move slowly, keeping their personal relationship clearly separate from any professional dealings between their two companies, careful never to let rumor or publicity define what they were building together. 6 months later, Grant's logistics company won a shipping contract with Prescott Meridian through a fully independent bidding process, and though his proposal wasn't the cheapest option on the table, it scored highest for transparency and operational efficiency. Marlowe deliberately abstained from the vote, entirely refusing to let even the appearance of favoritism touch the outcome. After the meeting concluded, the two of them met again, at the very same restaurant, where everything between them had first begun. Grant joked that he still to this day had never actually met Dean's real sister, and Marlowe laughed, telling him that maybe that was the single best thing that had ever failed to happen to either of them. Reaching into his jacket pocket, Grant pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, the receipt from their very first dinner together, which he had kept folded away as a quiet reminder that even the most dangerous nights could sometimes open the door to an entirely different life. He didn't rush toward any grand gesture or hurried proposal. He simply asked her with a small, easy smile whether this time she might like to order dessert with him, free of any corporate conspiracy waiting in the shadows. Marlowe laughed again, warmer than before, and said yes without a single moment of hesitation. Outside the restaurant that night, there was no photographer hiding across the street, no flash of light stolen through the glass, no threat waiting to be sent before sunrise. Grant and Marlowe walked out together through the front entrance in plain sight, unhurried and unguarded, no longer allowing anyone else to write the next chapter of their story for them.